The mist in the valley was a slow-moving river, a ghost of the real one that cut through the land. It clung to the new green of the meadows and turned the dark pines on the mountainsides into smudges of charcoal. Spring in Wyoming came with a promise it did not always keep, a thaw that could be snatched back by a sudden frost. On the high peaks, snow still held its ground, a stubborn white crown against a pale blue sky. Caleb Stone watched it from the porch of his cabin, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The air was clean and cold, smelling of wet earth and pine. It was an honest smell, the only kind he trusted anymore. His ranch, Stone Creek, was not much to look at. A sturdy cabin built by his own hands, a barn that leaned a little to the north, and corrals that were always in need of mending. But the land itself was good. The creek provided water. The valley gave good grass, and the mountains gave him a sense of being walled in and protected, even if he knew it was a lie. A man was never protected. Not really. The world could always find a way in. For Caleb, the world these days had a name: Silas Dugan. Dugan owned the biggest cattle operation in 3 counties and the only saloon in Red Hollow. He was a man who saw land not for what it could grow, but for what it could provide him: a quicker path, a fatter purse. Dugan wanted Stone Creek. He wanted to drive his herds right through Caleb's pasture, cutting a week off his trail time to the railhead. He had made offers, polite at first, then less so. Caleb had refused them all. This land was the last thing he had of his wife, Mary. Every fence post, every stone cleared from the field, was a memory of her. Selling it would be like selling her bones. He took a slow swallow of coffee. At 38, he felt older than the mountains. The silence he had once shared with Mary had become a hollow thing after she was gone, an emptiness that echoed with every gust of wind, every lowing calf. He kept busy. He had to. The work was a shield against the quiet. He told himself he wanted to keep the ranch. That was his purpose. But some nights, when the fire burned low and the wind howled a lonesome song, he knew he was just looking for a reason to get up when the sun did. He had not admitted that to anyone, least of all himself. The town of Red Hollow lay a few miles down the valley, a small collection of buildings huddled together as if for warmth. It lived on cattle and the fading memory of a silver mine that had given up its last treasure a decade ago. It was a place of hard-working people and gossiping tongues, a place Caleb avoided whenever he could. He had his own supplies, his own company. He did not need its whispers or its pity. The sky had been a deceptive blue all morning. By midday, it had turned the color of a bad bruise. The clouds rolled in from the west, heavy and dark, and the wind began to speak of rain. Caleb spent the afternoon securing his herd, checking the roof of the barn, and bringing in extra wood. He knew this kind of weather. It was not a gentle spring shower. It was a fury. The rain started just after dusk, a steady drumming that quickly became a roar. It fell in solid sheets, turning the hard-packed earth of his yard into a sea of mud. The creek, normally a placable stream you could step across in summer, began to swell. He could hear its angry voice rising over the storm, a deep growl that spoke of rocks being moved and banks being eaten away. He stood at his window for a long time, watching the lightning split the sky, feeling the cabin shudder with each clap of thunder. It was a night for staying put, a night that reminded a man how small he was. He was woken from a light sleep by a sound that did not belong to the storm. It was a splintering crash, followed by a human cry, thin and desperate, almost swallowed by the tempest. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his boots and his heavy slicker. He grabbed the lantern by the door, lit it, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore the lantern from his grip. The rain was a physical blow. The yard was a slick, dangerous mire. He held the lantern high, its yellow light cutting a small, wavering circle in the violent darkness. The sound had come from the direction of the creek, near the rough bridge he had built for the town road. He slogged through the mud, his boots sinking with every step. The creek was a monster, It was a churning, brown torrent, 3 times its normal width, carrying branches and debris in its violent rush. And in the middle of it, caught against the broken timbers of the bridge, was what was left of a supply wagon. One wheel was shattered, the canvas top ripped away. A horse, tangled in its harness, struggled and screamed in the freezing water. The cry he had heard was gone. He waded into the flood, the icy water a shock that stole his breath. It surged around his legs, pulling at him with incredible force. He fought his way toward the wreck, his eyes scanning the churning surface. He saw the horse go under, a final, awful cry drowned by the roar of the water. Then he saw it, a flash of blue, snagged on a broken piece of the wagon bed. He lunged for it, grabbing a handful of wet wool. It was a scarf, and it was attached to someone. He pulled with all his strength, his boots finding a precarious hold on a submerged rock. A woman's head broke the surface. Her eyes were wide with terror, her face deathly pale in the lantern light. She coughed, spitting out a lungful of water, but she did not scream again. It was the girl from the dressmaker's shop in town. Lily Hart. He had seen her a few times, a quiet thing with gentle eyes who always seemed to be looking for a place to disappear. She was an orphan, he had heard, with no one to her name. He shouted over the storm, his voice raw. "Hold on!" She tried to nod, her hands clawing weakly at the splintered wood. He worked his way closer, the current trying to rip him from his feet. He finally reached her, his strong hands closing around her arm. He untangled the blue scarf from the wreckage and pulled her free. She was limp in his arms, her body shaking uncontrollably from the cold. The water was trying to take them both now, to drag them down into the raging blackness. He put his arm around her waist, holding her tight against him. "We are going to the bank," he yelled into her ear. "Just hold on to me." She was too weak to do anything but cling to him, her face buried against his chest. He fought the creek for every inch. It was a brutal, physical battle against the raw power of nature. He felt his muscles strain, his lungs burn, but he did not let go. He could feel the fragile beat of her heart against his ribs, a fluttering, desperate rhythm that gave him a strength he did not know he possessed. He finally reached the bank, hauling her out of the water and onto the slick, muddy ground. They collapsed together, gasping for air. The rain continued to pour down, cold and relentless. She was shaking so hard he thought she might break. Her dress was thin, offering no protection. She was soaked to the bone, her lips already turning blue. He knew he had to get her warm. Fast. He looked at her, this small, half-drowned woman in the heart of the storm. He could not leave her here. The road back to town was impassable, likely washed out completely. His cabin was the only shelter for miles. He scooped her up into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, as if she were made of nothing but bird bones and grit. He carried her through the sucking mud, his own exhaustion a dull ache in his bones. The lantern cast dancing shadows ahead of them, a tiny beacon of hope in the overwhelming dark. She was mumbling something, her voice a faint whisper against the howling wind. He leaned his head down to listen. "Thank you," she said. Her breath was a cold puff against his neck. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the stove was a blessing. He set her down gently in the chair by the hearth, her body slumping against the wood. Her clothes were dripping a puddle onto the floorboards. Her skin was like ice. He stoked the fire, adding logs until it roared back to life, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. He turned back to her. She was watching him, her eyes wide and dark in her pale face. The fear was still there, but there was something else too, a flicker of trust. It made him deeply uncomfortable. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said, his voice sounding rougher than he intended. "You will catch your death." He went to his chest and pulled out a thick wool blanket and one of his own shirts, laying them on the table. He did not look at her as he spoke again. "I will be outside. I have to check on the barn. Call when you are done." He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked out the door, back into the diminishing rain, leaving her alone in the warmth of his home. He did not go to the barn. He went to the porch and stood in the shadows, listening to the storm die down and the creek slowly quiet its angry voice. He was a man who lived by a strict code, a code of honor and propriety that had been ingrained in him since birth, and he had just brought a young, unmarried woman into his house for the night, a woman who was not his wife. He knew what the gossips in Red Hollow would make of that. They would strip her reputation bare, and they would not be gentle about it. He felt a grim knot tighten in his stomach. He had saved her from the water, only to potentially throw her to the wolves. He waited for what felt like a long time. When he finally heard her small voice call out that she was ready, he went back inside. She was huddled in the chair, wrapped in the blanket, his flannel shirt hanging loosely on her small frame. Her wet dress and clothes were hung carefully over a rack by the fire. Her long, dark hair was damp and spread over her shoulders. The blue woolen scarf was draped next to her dress, the color a stark, hopeful line in the firelight. She looked small and lost, but she was alive. He busied himself making coffee, keeping his back to her. The silence in the cabin was thick and awkward. It was different from the silence of his loneliness. This was a silence filled with unspoken things, with the charged awareness of a man and a woman, alone, under one roof. He finally turned, handing her a warm mug. She took it with trembling hands, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him that he had not felt in years. He stepped back quickly, putting a safe distance between them. "The road will be washed out until morning. Maybe longer," he said, staring at the fire instead of at her. "You can have the bed. I will sleep here by the stove." His tone was flat, leaving no room for argument. He was drawing a line, for her sake as well as his own. She just nodded, clutching the mug as if it were a lifeline. Her gaze was fixed on the floor. He could see the shame and gratitude fighting in her expression. It was a painful thing to watch. He had seen that look on wounded animals, a mix of fear and the desperate hope for kindness. They did not speak again for a long time. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the last remnants of the rain tapping against the roof. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly changed. Finally, he broke the silence again, his voice low and steady. "I will take you back to town as soon as the road is dry." She did not look up, but she answered, her voice so soft he almost did not hear it. "What if?" she murmured into her coffee mug, a question aimed more at the floor than at him. "What if I have nowhere to go back to?" Lily woke to the unfamiliar quiet of a house that was not her own. Sunlight, pale and soft, streamed through a clean window pane, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then the memory of the flood, the icy water, and the strong arms that pulled her from it came rushing back. She was in Caleb Stone's cabin, in his bed. She sat up quickly, clutching the thick wool blanket to her chest. The cabin was warm and smelled of wood smoke and brewing coffee. His shirt, the one he had given her, was soft against her skin. Ridiculously large, but a comfort all the same. She listened. There was no sound from within the small home. She slipped out of the bed, her bare feet cold on the smooth wooden floorboards. Her own clothes, dry now, were neatly folded on the chair where she had left them. His bedroll was on the floor by the cold stove, a silent testament to the honorable distance he had kept. She felt a blush creep up her neck. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons on her dress. The simple act of putting on her own clothes felt like putting on a suit of armor, preparing herself for the day and the awkwardness it would surely bring. When she stepped outside, the world was bright and clean. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was sharp and cool. Caleb was by the corral, mending a fence post that had been loosened by the storm. He worked with a quiet, efficient rhythm, his movements sure and strong. He did not seem to notice her at first, his focus entirely on his task. She stood on the porch, unsure of what to do. feeling like a misplaced piece of furniture. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the muddy yard. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of solemn duty and something else she could not name. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good morning," she answered, her own voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for everything." He just gave a short, sharp nod and turned back to his work, as if her gratitude made him uncomfortable. Lily went back inside, her cheeks burning. She was in his debt, a guest in his home, and she hated the feeling of being useless. Her gaze fell on the kitchen area. It was tidy, but stark, a bachelor's kitchen. Without a second thought, she began to move. She found flour and lard, put the coffee pot back on the stove to heat, and found a skillet. She worked with the same quiet efficiency he did, her hands remembering the familiar motions of making breakfast. It was the only way she knew how to speak, to show her thanks through action rather than words that seemed to get stuck in her throat. When he came back inside, the cabin was filled with the smell of fresh biscuits and frying salt pork. He stopped in the doorway, surprised. He looked from the table, set for two, to her, standing by the stove with a flushed face. "You did not have to do that," he said. She just shook her head. "I wanted to. It is the least I can do." They ate in a silence that was different from the night before. It was less tense, more of a careful truce. They kept their eyes on their plates, the space between them filled with the small sounds of forks scraping against tin and coffee being sipped. It was a strange and clumsy dance of propriety. He was a man who had forgotten what it was like to have a woman in his kitchen, and she was a woman who had never known a man's kindness without a price attached. After breakfast, he went back to his chores, and she set about cleaning the cabin. She washed the dishes, swept the floor, and even straightened the books on his small shelf. She was creating order, trying to pay her way. She needed to feel she was earning her keep, not just accepting charity. Every so often, she would glance out the window and see him, a solitary figure moving against the vast landscape, and a strange pang of something akin to longing would ache in her chest. It was a foolish feeling, she told herself, a dangerous one. Around noon, a man on horseback rode into the yard. He was a lanky, older fellow with a weathered face and a mailbag slung over his shoulder. "Caleb," the man called out. "Dismounting. Got your mail. That was some storm last night. Took down the old cottonwood by Miller's Ridge." Caleb walked over, taking the small stack of letters the rider held out. "Thanks." Jedediah rode to town holding up. "Mostly," Jedediah said, his curious eyes flicking toward the cabin door, where Lily had inadvertently appeared. "Some washouts, but passable if you are careful." He gave Caleb a knowing look. "Heard you might be expecting some company." Caleb's face hardened. "Just the mail. Jedediah, that is all." The mail rider gave a small shrug and mounted his horse. "Well, you have a good day now." He tipped his hat in Lily's direction and rode off, leaving a trail of dust and unspoken questions in his wake. Caleb stood in the yard for a long moment, staring at the letters in his hand. He walked back to the porch, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He sifted through the mail, a bill of sale for some feed, an advertisement for a new kind of barbed wire, and a thick, official-looking envelope made of heavy parchment. He frowned, turning it over. It was addressed to him, in a flowing, unfamiliar script. He tore it open. Lily, who had been about to go back inside, saw the color drain from his face. She watched as his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a cold, quiet fury. He looked up, and his eyes, when they met hers, were hard as flint. "What is this?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. He held out the paper for her to see. She took it, her hands trembling. It was a document filled with formal, legal language. At the top, in bold letters, were the words "Contract of Matrimony," and below, it listed the two parties, Caleb Stone of the Stone Creek Ranch and Lily Hart of Red Hollow. Her breath caught in her throat. She read the words again, but they would not change. It was a mail order, bride contract. It stated that she, Lily, had agreed to marry him in exchange for passage and keep. It was dated 2 months prior, and at the bottom, next to a space for her signature, was a clumsy, forged version of his own. Tucked inside the envelope was a separate piece of paper with hand-drawn directions to his ranch. "This is a lie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I have never seen this before in my life. I would never—" She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "You have to believe me." His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped. He took the paper from her, his gaze scanning the page again. "This paper," he said, his voice tight. "It is the expensive kind Silas Dugan sells at his mercantile. The ink, too. And this signature. It is a fair imitation, but it is not mine. Someone went to a lot of trouble." Lily felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Dugan, the man whose advances she had been fending off for months at her old job. The man who owned the saloon and half the town. The man who wanted Caleb's land. The pieces began to click into place with a sickening certainty. The contract, the directions, the convenient timing of the wagon accident that had stranded her here. It was a setup, a cruel, calculated trap. The rumor Jedediah had hinted at was not a guess. It was already a fact in town. She was Caleb Stone's mail-order bride, the girl who had shown up in the middle of a storm. Just as expected. The shame was so intense it was like a physical blow. She felt branded, labeled as a desperate, scheming woman who had trapped a lonely rancher. "I have to leave," she said, turning toward the cabin. "I will get my things. I cannot stay here. I will not bring this trouble to your door." "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice losing some of its edge, replaced by a weary resignation. "Back to town, back to the boarding house. Do you think they will believe you?" She stopped, her back to him. Of course they would not. Mrs. Pike, her landlady, would be the first to cast a stone. The Reverend Michael would preach a sermon on the sins of women, and Silas Dugan would be there, watching, with a smug smile on his face. She would be ruined, a social outcast with nowhere to turn. Dugan would see her desperation and would corner her. And this time, there would be no escape. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She turned back to face him, her pride warring with her terror. "I do not know," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But I cannot stay. They will say I planned this, that I am trying to take your land, your name." He looked away, out toward the mountains, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was a man who valued his solitude, his honor. This contract was an attack on both. It dragged him into the very kind of messy, public scandal he had spent years avoiding. And yet, he had pulled this woman from a raging creek. He had seen the terror in her eyes. He could not, in good conscience, throw her back into a different kind of flood. The lonely part of him, the part that remembered the warmth of a shared home, felt a flicker of something he quickly suppressed. This was not about desire. It was about decency. "This is not your fault," he said finally, his voice firm, "and it is not mine. Someone is playing a dirty game, and we are the pieces. If you go back now, you prove them right. You give them the victory." "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice small. He was silent for a long time, the only sound the wind sighing through the pines. He was weighing his options, the practical, logical mind of a rancher assessing a problem. "You will stay," he said at last. "The decision made, not as a bride, not as a guest. You will work for me. Housekeeping, cooking. I will pay you a fair wage. We will tell anyone who asks that I hired you on after your wagon was destroyed. It is a plausible story. It will give us time." Time for what she asked. "Time to find out who forged this document," he said, his eyes now glinting with a hard resolve, "and to make them answer for it." A fragile tendril of hope unfurled in Lily's chest. It was a business arrangement, a respectable, temporary solution. It offered her a roof over her head, a shield from the gossip, and most importantly, a chance at justice. It was an act of profound kindness, dressed up in the practical clothes of a rancher's logic. She looked at this quiet, solitary man, who was willing to risk his own reputation to protect hers. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady for the first time since she had seen the letter. "I will work for you, Mr. Stone, until this is all sorted out." He gave another one of his short nods. "Then call me Caleb. It would be strange for an employer and his housekeeper to be so formal. And you must call me Lily." The agreement hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge built over a chasm of lies and suspicion. It was a pact born of necessity, a partnership forged in the face of a common enemy. The days ahead at Stone Creek would be a careful negotiation of boundaries and a quiet search for truth. A silent battle against a town full of whispers and a man who wanted them both to fail. The days at Stone Creek fell into a quiet rhythm, a silent agreement negotiated without words. Lily rose with the sun, her presence a soft counterpoint to the cabin's masculine starkness. She moved with a purpose that was both determined and gentle, a woman reclaiming a small piece of the world for herself. She took over the cooking and cleaning not as a servant, but as a partner in the simple act of living. Caleb would come in from his morning chores to find the coffee hot and the biscuits warm, a comfort so long absent from his life that it felt both foreign and deeply familiar. He said little, but she saw his appreciation in the way his shoulders relaxed, in the brief, unguarded moments he would watch her work. They kept their distance. It was a wide, invisible river flowing through the center of the small cabin. They did not speak of the forged contract, but it was always there, the unspoken reason for their strange arrangement. They were careful not to brush past each other in the narrow spaces, their movements a clumsy, courteous dance. Lily took the main bed as her own, and each night Caleb would unroll his bedding by the cold stove, a clear and unwavering boundary. She found a small patch of earth near the cabin that caught the morning sun and began to turn it over, her hands finding solace in the rich, dark soil. She planted a few hardy vegetables, seeds she had found in a tin in the pantry. It was an act of faith, a belief in a future that extended beyond the next sunrise. When she found one of his flannel shirts with a tear in the sleeve, she mended it with small, neat stitches, her needle and thread a quiet language of gratitude. One afternoon, Caleb found her watching his horse, a calm, steady mare named Dust Devil. She reached a tentative hand out to stroke the horse's nose, her touch feather-light. "You should learn to ride," he said, his voice startling her. She pulled her hand back quickly. "Oh, I could not. I would be a bother." "It is not a bother," he said, his tone practical. "A woman alone in this country should have a way to leave if she needs to. A fast horse is a better friend than most people." His words were a stark reminder of her vulnerability, but they were also an offering. The lessons began the next day. He was a patient teacher, his instructions clear and concise. He stood close, his presence a solid warmth at her back as he showed her how to hold the reins, how to sit the saddle. His hands would briefly cover hers, adjusting her grip, and at these moments a current would pass between them, unspoken and powerful. Lily's heart would hammer against her ribs, and she would focus fiercely on the horse's ears, trying to ignore the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to him. He was giving her a tool for survival, a means of escape, and yet with every lesson, the thought of leaving Stone Creek grew a little more painful. Spring in the high country was a season of raw power. The thaw was not a gentle melting, but a violent breaking. The wind was a constant presence, a wild spirit that tore at the cabin and howled through the canyons. It rattled the windows and whistled under the door, a reminder of nature's indifference. The true test came one moonless night. The wind had been relentless all day, and as darkness fell, a new sound joined its chorus, a high, quavering howl, answered by another. Closer this time, wolves. They were drawn by the scent of the newborn calves, small and helpless in the north pasture. Caleb came inside, his face grim in the lantern light. "They are close," he said. "Too close. I am staying in the barn tonight." "I am coming with you," Lily said, her voice firm. There was no hesitation. He looked at her, about to argue, then saw the resolve in her eyes and simply nodded. He handed her a heavy wool coat, and they stepped out into the wild, roaring dark. The barn was a sanctuary of animal warmth and the sweet smell of hay. Caleb lit a second lantern, its glow pushing back the shadows. He checked his rifle, his movements economical and sure. Lily took a spot on a hay bale, her own senses straining against the darkness beyond the barn walls. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind and the occasional, chilling howl that seemed to circle them. The calves huddled close to their mothers, their soft bleating a fragile sound in the immense, threatening night. To fill the silence, she began to speak, her voice low. "I used to be afraid of the dark. When I was a little girl at the orphanage, the nights were the worst. So many of us in one room, but you still felt so alone." Caleb did not look at her, his gaze fixed on the barn door, but she knew he was listening. He leaned his rifle against the wall beside him. "My wife, Mary, she loved the night. She said you could hear the world breathing. She used to sit out on the porch and name the stars." He paused, the memory a tangible thing in the small space. After she died of the fever, the silence in this house became a different thing. It was not peaceful anymore. It was just empty. It was the first time he had spoken her name. Lily felt the weight of his loss, the years of solitude he had wrapped around himself like a shroud. She wanted to offer some word of comfort, but no words seemed adequate. Instead, she found herself telling him things she had never told anyone else. "Before I worked at the dressmaker's, I had a job at the saloon in Rock Springs, just for a few weeks, washing glasses. The men there—" She trailed off, the memory making her shiver. "They look at you like you are something to be bought, something they have a right to. Their hands are always reaching. That is why I came to Red Hollow. I thought a smaller town would be safer." She gave a small, humorless laugh. "I did not count on meeting Mr. Dugan." Caleb's hands tightened into fists. He did not say anything, but a cold, hard anger settled in his eyes. In that shared darkness, surrounded by the sleeping animals and the threat of the wolves outside, a new level of understanding passed between them. They were two solitary people, survivors of different kinds of loss, who had found a temporary harbor in each other's company. The unspoken trust that had been a seedling began to put down roots. The wolves did not attack. As the first gray light of dawn broke over the mountains, their howls faded into the distance. The vigil was over. They walked back to the cabin, weary but bound by the shared experience. Later that morning, as she was tidying, Lily saw a branch of wild cottonwood, its fluffy white tufts like small clouds. She broke off a sprig and put it in an empty glass bottle on the windowsill. It was a small, simple thing, but it changed the room. It was a touch of life, of softness, a sign that this was not just a shelter, but a home. The outside world, however, would not be kept at bay. A few days later, two riders came into the yard. They were not friendly visitors. One was a large, beefy man with a cruel mouth, the other wiry and ferret-faced. They worked for Silas Dugan. Lily watched from the window as Caleb met them on the porch. "Stone," the big one said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Dugan wants to know when you are going to be sensible about his offer." "I already gave him my answer," Caleb said, his voice level. "The answer is no." The ferret-faced man sneered. "Things can get expensive for a man on his own. Records show you are a little behind on your county taxes. It would be a shame if the sheriff had to get involved." Just then, as if on cue, Deputy Sheriff Wade rode past on the main road. He glanced toward the ranch, saw the confrontation, and spurred his horse on. His gaze fixed determinedly on the horizon. The message was clear. There would be no help from the law. "The taxes are paid," Caleb said, his voice like ice. "I have the receipts. Now get off my land." The big man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You are a stubborn man. Stone, Dugan does not like stubborn men." He spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dirt, narrowly missing Caleb's boot before they turned their horses and rode away. Lily came out onto the porch after they were gone, her heart pounding. "They are trying to scare you," she said. Caleb stared after them, his jaw tight. It will take more than that. But the encounter left a foul taste in the air, a promise of more trouble to come. Later that week, the paperboy from town, a freckle-faced youth named Samuel, made his weekly delivery. He was a cheerful boy, full of news and gossip. "That was some storm a while back," he said to Caleb, handing him the newspaper. "My big brother, Jacob, he works as a clerk at Dugan's Mercantile. You know, he said he had the strangest task last month. Some fella came in, paid him extra to type up a peculiar kind of contract on Mr. Dugan's fancy new typewriter machine. Real secret-like." Caleb froze, his hand still outstretched. "What kind of contract?" Samuel shrugged. "Do not know for sure. Jacob said it looked like something for a marriage. He thought it was funny. Who uses a typewriter for a thing like that?" Caleb and Lily exchanged a look over the boy's head. It was a lightning strike of understanding. The paper, the ink, the professionally typed words. It all came from Dugan's store. It was the first solid piece of evidence they had. After the boy left, the air in the cabin was charged with a new energy. They had a lead. The lie had a source. The feeling of shared purpose was a palpable thing between them. That evening, as they were moving supplies into the small root cellar before another predicted storm, the unspoken tension finally broke. They reached for a heavy sack of grain at the same time, intending to lift it together. As their hands closed around the rough burlap, their fingers brushed. It was a simple, fleeting contact, but it was enough. A jolt, sharp and warm, shot up Lily's arm. She snatched her hand back as if burned. Caleb did the same. His face suddenly flushed. They stood there in the cool, earthy-smelling cellar, unable to meet each other's eyes, the space between them suddenly crackling with an energy that had nothing to do with contracts or enemies, and everything to do with the simple, undeniable truth of a man and a woman, alone in a quiet place. The careful distance they had maintained for weeks had vanished in an instant, leaving them both breathless and profoundly flustered. The awkwardness from the cellar lingered between them for days, a palpable thing that made the small cabin feel even smaller. They moved around each other with a renewed, almost painful carefulness. Their conversations, which had just begun to find a tentative footing, retreated into the safety of necessity. More wood for the fire. The fence needs mending. The coffee is hot. Each polite phrase was a brick being placed back onto the wall that had, for a moment, shown a crack. Caleb found himself staying out later, finding chores that did not need doing, his solitude a familiar but no longer comfortable coat. Lily threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors that were already clean and kneading dough with a vigor that left her knuckles white. They were two people holding their breath, waiting for a storm that had already passed to finally break. The real storm came without warning. Spring, with its fickle temperament, decided to offer one last taste of winter. The day began with a sky the color of lead, and a strange, heavy stillness in the air. The temperature plummeted. By noon, the first flakes of snow began to drift down, fat and wet and silent. They were a novelty at first, a beautiful, unseasonable curiosity. But they did not stop. The gentle drift became a thick, swirling curtain, and the wind began to rise, not with the roar of a rainstorm, but with a high, mournful whine. Caleb came in from the pasture, his hat and shoulders white, his expression dark with concern. "It is a blizzard," he said, shaking the snow from his coat. "Coming on fast. I've got a heifer about to calve. She is having a hard time of it. I need to get her into the barn." Lily was already pulling on the heavy coat he had loaned her. "I will help." He did not argue. This was not a time for propriety. It was a time for survival. They went out into the whirling white chaos. The world had been erased, reduced to the cabin, the barn, and the blinding snow that fell between them. The wind cut like a knife, and the snow stung their faces. They found the heifer in a small, sheltered coulee, already down on her side, her breath coming in ragged, steaming gasps. She was a young one, and it was her first calf. Getting her to her feet and moving her through the deepening snow was a brutal, exhausting struggle. Caleb pushed from behind, his shoulder against the animal's flank, while Lily took the lead, coaxing and pulling, her voice a low, encouraging murmur against the shriek of the wind. By the time they wrestled the exhausted animal into the relative peace of the barn, they were both soaked through. Not from rain this time, but from melted snow and sweat. The barn was cold, the wind finding its way through 100 tiny cracks, but it was a refuge from the storm's full fury. The calf was coming wrong. Caleb worked with a grim, focused intensity. His sleeves rolled up to his elbows, his voice a low, steady stream of reassurance to the laboring mother. Lily was at his side, handing him ropes, bringing warm water. Her earlier fear replaced by a steely competence. She had a gentle way with the animal, her hand stroking the heifer's neck, her presence a small island of calm in the midst of the pain and struggle. After what felt like an eternity, with a final, heroic effort from the mother and Caleb's strong, sure pull, the calf was born. It lay steaming and still on the straw for a terrifying moment before it gave a weak shudder and let out a thin, wavering cry. Relief washed over them, so potent it left them weak. They had done it. They had cheated the storm of one small life. Lily knelt in the straw, rubbing the calf with a dry sack, her face glowing with a triumphant, maternal warmth that made Caleb's breath catch in his throat. He had not seen a look like that, so full of life and fierce joy, in a very long time. He turned away to give the new mother some feed, and it was only then that he realized the storm had not lessened. It had grown worse. The wind was a solid wall of sound, and the snow was a blinding, impenetrable veil. Going back to the cabin, even that short distance, would be suicide. They were trapped. He built up the small charcoal brazier in the corner of the tack room, its heat a small but welcome comfort. He found a couple of old horse blankets and hung one over the doorway to block the worst of the draft. They settled in for a long wait, the sounds of the storm and the soft noises of the animals their only companions. It was then that Lily began to shiver. At first, it was just a slight tremor, but as the minutes stretched on, the shivering became more violent, racking her small frame. Her dress, soaked and clinging to her, was a sheet of ice against her skin. Her teeth chattered, a desperate, uncontrolled rhythm in the quiet of the barn. Caleb saw it and his face tightened. "You are freezing." He took off his own heavy wool coat, the one he had worn through the worst of the work, and draped it over her shoulders. It was a massive weight, smelling of the cold night air and of him. She huddled under it, but the shaking did not stop. Her lips were tinged with blue. He knew the danger. A chill that went that deep could settle in the lungs, could turn into a fever that no frontier doctor could fix. It was how he had lost Mary. The memory, sharp and brutal, pierced through the wall of his composure. He would not let it happen again. "We have to get you dry," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He looked away from her, staring at the glowing coals in the brazier, his mind racing. There was no privacy here, no separate room, only this small, open space, lit by a single lantern. His honor, his strict, unbending code, warred with the primal, urgent need to protect her. Lily looked at him, her eyes wide and dark in her pale face. She saw the conflict in the rigid set of his jaw, in the way he would not meet her gaze. She understood his dilemma, but she also understood the cold that was seeping into her very bones, a deep, deadly chill that was stealing the strength from her limbs. She had been saved from a flood of water only to be threatened by a flood of ice. And in that moment, she knew, with an absolute and unwavering certainty, that she was safer with this man than she had ever been in her life. The trust she had been carefully nurturing, the trust born of his quiet decency and unwavering respect, blossomed into a faith so complete it eclipsed all fear, all shame. She took a breath, the air stuttering in her lungs. Her voice, when she spoke, was a whisper, but it cut through the sound of the wind with perfect clarity. "Undress me, cowboy." Caleb froze. The words hung in the air between them, shocking in their intimacy, terrifying in their implication. He finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. He saw no seduction there, no trickery. He saw only a desperate, honest plea. And he saw a trust so profound it humbled him. "So I can put on something dry," she added, her cheeks flushing a deep, painful red, but her gaze never wavering. "Before I freeze, I trust you." The last three words shattered something inside him. The lonely, grieving man who had hidden his heart behind a wall of solitude and propriety found that wall reduced to dust. This was not about desire. It was about something far more sacred. It was about a life placed in his hands, a woman's honor given freely into his keeping, and he would be damned before he failed that trust. Without another word, he turned his back to her completely, presenting her with the solid, unmoving shield of his broad shoulders. He reached for a clean, dry horse blanket from a nearby stack, its wool rough and warm. He held it out behind him, his arm outstretched, his face turned resolutely toward the far wall of the barn. He listened. He heard the fumbling of her cold fingers on the buttons of his coat, the soft slide of the heavy wool as she shrugged it off. He heard the rustle of her wet dress, a sound that was at once incredibly intimate and completely innocent. He heard her sharp intake of breath as the cold air hit her skin. He stood like a statue, his every muscle tensed, his entire being focused on the simple, monumental task of not turning around. He tended to the brazier, adding a few more coals, his movements stiff and deliberate, his gaze locked on the glowing embers as if his life depended on it. He felt the light tug as she took the blanket from his hand. Then there was only the sound of the wind and the soft, almost inaudible rustle of wool as she wrapped herself in its dry folds. A long, silent moment passed. "You can turn around now," she said, her voice small, muffled by the blanket. He turned slowly. She was sitting on the hay bale, swaddled from her shoulders to her feet in the thick, gray blanket. Only her face and her bare feet were visible. Her wet clothes lay in a heap on the floor, a testament to the boundary they had just crossed. She looked small, vulnerable, and yet her eyes held a strength and a gratitude that struck him to the core. The blush was still high on her cheeks, but the fear was gone. He picked up her wet dress and, without looking at it, hung it on a hook near the brazier to dry. He then took his own coat and laid it over her bundled form, adding another layer of warmth. He sat on a separate hay bale a respectable distance away, picked up his rifle, and began the unnecessary task of cleaning it. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. A line had been crossed, a new chapter begun. Not with a touch, but with its deliberate and respectful absence. The physical barrier between them had been removed in an act of absolute necessity, and in its place, an emotional bond had been forged, stronger than any wall. Caleb, the man who had closed his heart to the world, felt a painful, unfamiliar cracking around it, and Lily, the woman who had always been alone, realized she had found a place where she was utterly and completely safe. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the barn, the wind finally died down. The world outside was hushed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The storm was over, and in the quiet stillness of the barn, a silent promise had been made and honored, a promise that would change everything. The world after the blizzard was a place of deep, unnatural quiet. The snow muffled all sound, burying the valley in a blanket of pristine white. For 2 days, Stone Creek was an island, cut off from the world, in the shared isolation. The wall between Caleb and Lily dissolved. The memory of the barn was not a source of shame, but a shared secret, a foundation of trust built in the heart of a storm. They spoke more freely, their conversations filled with the easy comfort of two people who had weathered something profound together. A fragile peace settled over the small cabin, a sense of rightness that felt both new and ancient. Lily found herself smiling without thinking, and Caleb's gruff silence was often broken by a low chuckle. It was a dangerous, hopeful time. The peace was shattered the moment the roads became passable. Caleb had to ride into Red Hollow for supplies, and Lily insisted on going with him. She would not hide, she said, her chin held high. She was his housekeeper, and she had a right to be there. He reluctantly agreed, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. The town felt different. As they rode down the main street, conversation stopped. People turned to stare, their faces a mixture of avid curiosity and cold judgment. Whispers followed them like a swarm of insects. At the mercantile, the clerk served them with a frosty civility, his eyes darting from Caleb to Lily and back again. Mrs. Pike, Lily's former landlady, saw them from across the street and made a great show of gathering her skirts and hurrying away as if they carried a plague. The source of the poison became clear when they passed the saloon. Silas Dugan was holding court on the boardwalk, a smug, proprietary smile on his face. "It is a sad thing," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air, loud enough for all to hear. "A sad thing indeed when a man brings a decent, trusting woman all the way out here with promises, only to cast her aside. A man of honor would see his obligations through." Several of Dugan's cronies grunted in agreement. Caleb's hand tightened on his reins, his knuckles turning white. He felt Lily flinch beside him as if she had been struck. The rumor of the snowstorm, of the night spent together, had not just spread. It had been twisted into a weapon, and Dugan was wielding it with practiced skill. He was painting Caleb as a villain and Lily as his victim, a poor, abandoned mail-order bride. They rode back to the ranch in a heavy, wounded silence. The easy peace they had found was gone, replaced by the ugly reality of their situation. That night, Caleb made a decision. He had to get to the source. The next day, he rode out alone, leaving Lily at the ranch with a rifle and firm instructions to use it if anyone but him appeared. He did not go to town. He circled around, taking the long way to the small homestead where Jacob, the paperboy's brother, lived with his family. He found the young man chopping wood, his movements jerky and nervous. "I need to talk to you about the contract," Caleb said, his voice low and direct. "The one you typed for the man at the mercantile." Jacob's face went pale. "I cannot," he stammered, his eyes wide with fear. "Mr. Dugan, he would fire me, or worse." "Getting an innocent woman's name dragged through the mud is already worse," Caleb said, his gaze hard. "She did nothing wrong, neither did I, but we need proof." The young clerk was torn. His fear of Dugan was immense, but the decency in him won out. He glanced around nervously before leading Caleb to the back of his woodshed. From under a loose floorboard, he pulled a thin, flimsy piece of paper, a carbon copy. He had made it without being asked, a small act of self-preservation. "Here," he whispered, shoving it into Caleb's hand. "This is all I have. Do not tell anyone where you got it, please." Caleb rode back to Stone Creek as if the devil were on his heels. In the privacy of the cabin, he and Lily spread the flimsy copy out on the table. It was the same as the original, with one damning addition. At the bottom, below the forged signature for Caleb, was a line for a witness, and on that line was a signature, an almost perfect imitation of the flamboyant, looping hand of Deputy Sheriff Wade. The room grew cold. This was no longer just a malicious rumor spread by a greedy landowner. It was a conspiracy. Dugan had not only fabricated the contract, but he had also implicated the law in his scheme. Wade was either a willing partner or was being blackmailed. Either way, they were no longer fighting a man. They were fighting the system he controlled. Their new, dangerous knowledge had little time to settle before the next blow fell. A rider, an official courier from town, delivered a sealed envelope. It was a summons. Lily Hart was formally requested to appear at a public civil hearing in 2 days' time. The purpose of the hearing, it stated, was to clarify the legal standing of the marriage contract between herself and Mr. Caleb Stone. A contract, Mr. Dugan was now publicly championing on her behalf. Lily stared at the document, the words blurring before her eyes. It was a trap, a public spectacle designed to humiliate her. She would be forced to stand before the entire town and be questioned. Her past, her character, her very honor would be picked apart by Dugan's lawyer. She had a choice. She realized. A stark and terrible one. She could lie. She could stand up and claim the contract was real, that she was Caleb's intended bride. The lie would save her from the immediate shame, would silence the gossip, and would turn Dugan's weapon against him. But it would be a cage, trapping her in a falsehood, forcing Caleb into a union he never sought. Or she could tell the truth. She could fight for justice, expose the forgery, and clear their names. But the cost would be her reputation. They would call her a liar, a fallen woman. They would dissect the night of the flood, the night of the blizzard. They would leave her with nothing. That night, the distance returned between them. A chasm of fear and impossible choices. Caleb watched her, his face etched with a guilt so profound it was a physical pain. He was the one who had brought her here. His feud with Dugan had made her a pawn. He felt a selfish, possessive anger at the thought of the town looking at her, judging her. He finally spoke, his voice heavy with a pain that tore at her heart. "Lily, you do not have to do this. This is my fight. I can give you money, enough to get you far away from here. You could go to Cheyenne, or even farther east. Start over, where no one knows you, where your name is still your own." His words were meant to be kind, an offer of protection, but to Lily, they sounded like a dismissal. They felt like he was giving up. She saw herself as he must see her, a burden, a complication, a weight that was dragging him down. The fear she had been holding at bay, the fear of being a liability, crashed over her in a wave of despair. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the bravest thing to do was to disappear. She went to the small chest where she kept her few belongings. Her hand brushed against the soft wool of her blue scarf. She pulled it out. She had worn it on the wagon that fateful night, a bright symbol of her quiet hopes for a new, peaceful life. Now, as she looked at it in the flickering lamplight, she saw that the edges were frayed, the wool worn thin in places from being snagged on the wreckage and from her own anxious twisting of it in her hands. It was damaged, tested, just like her, but it had not unraveled. It was still a whole thing, still a line of defiant color in the dim light. She turned to face him, the scarf clutched in her hand. Her eyes, which had been clouded with fear, were now clear and resolute. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I am not running. I ran once before. From Rock Springs. I will not run again." "But Lily, they will destroy you," he said, his voice raw. "And what will be left of me if I let a man like Silas Dugan chase me from my own life? If I let them brand me a coward on top of everything else they will call me?" She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "You showed me what honor was, Caleb, that night in the barn. You showed me respect when I was at my most vulnerable. You taught me that my dignity is not something another person can take away. It is something I have to hold on to. I am staying, and I am going to that hearing, and I am going to tell the truth." He looked at her, at this small, determined woman who had been battered by life but refused to be broken. The guilt in his chest was replaced by a surge of fierce, protective pride so intense it nearly took his breath away. He had offered her an escape, but she had chosen to stand and fight, not just for herself, but for him. The crack between them, the one opened by his guilt and her fear, was sealed, filled with a new and profound respect. He knew then that he was not just fighting for his land anymore. He was fighting for her, and it was a fight he had no intention of losing. With only one day until the hearing, a grim resolve settled over the cabin. They rode into Red Hollow not as a man and his housekeeper, but as allies preparing for battle. The town's hostile quiet was a familiar pressure now, but they met the stairs with a united, unwavering front. Their first stop was not the mercantile or the sheriff's office, but the small livery stable where Samuel, the paperboy, often helped his father. They found him pitching hay, his cheerful face turning serious when he saw their expressions. Caleb spoke first, his voice low and urgent, making sure no one else was within earshot. "Samuel, we need your help," he said. "The contract you mentioned, the one your brother Jacob saw. We need to know who typed it. It is not enough to know it was done at Dugan's store. We need the person." The boy's eyes widened with understanding, and a little fear. He knew, as everyone in the valley did, that crossing Silas Dugan was a dangerous business. He chewed on his lip, his gaze darting around the dusty stable yard. Jacob did not see who ordered it. He whispered, "But he knows who runs the typewriter. It is Elena Vega. She works in the back office, keeping the books. She is quiet, keeps to herself." "Where can we find her?" Lily asked, her voice gentle but firm. "We will not bring trouble to her. We just need to talk." Samuel thought for a moment. "She takes her lunch by the old church bell. Every day. She likes the quiet." He looked from Lily's earnest face to Caleb's unyielding one. "Be careful, mister. Dugan keeps a close eye on everyone who works for him." They found Elena Vega just where Samuel said she would be, sitting on a stone bench in the small, overgrown churchyard, a piece of bread and cheese in her lap. She was a young woman, not much older than Lily, with tired, intelligent eyes and the pale complexion of someone who spent her days indoors. When she saw them approach, a hunted look came over her face, and she quickly gathered her things as if to flee. "Please, Miss Vega," Lily said, holding up a hand. "We only want a moment of your time. We mean you no harm." Elena hesitated, her gaze fixed on Caleb, who stood a respectful distance away, his presence large and intimidating. Lily stepped forward alone, sitting on the other end of the bench. "My name is Lily Hart," she said softly, "and this is Caleb Stone. We believe you were asked to type a document a few months ago, a marriage contract." Elena's face went ashen. She stared down at her hands, her knuckles white. "I do not know what you are talking about," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just type what I am told to type. Invoices, letters, orders for the store. That is all." "We know you are in a difficult position," Lily continued, her voice filled with an empathy that came from her own experiences. "We know what kind of man Mr. Dugan is. We know he does not treat his workers kindly, but an innocent man's home and my good name are being threatened by that piece of paper. We have a copy. We know Deputy Wade's name is on it as a witness. This is a crime, Elena, and you are the only one who can tell the truth about how it started." Elena looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears. "What can I do? He will ruin me. I have my mother to support. He will see to it that I never get another job in this territory." Caleb stepped forward then, his shadow falling over them. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. "Miss Vega," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that held no threat, only a solemn promise. "If you agree to testify to what you know at the hearing tomorrow, I will give you my word. I will see that you are protected. If Dugan fires you, I will find you a new position, even if I have to pay your wages myself until you are settled. I will not let him harm you for doing the right thing." Elena looked from Caleb's sincere, weathered face to Lily's pleading one. She saw in them not the schemers and villains the town was whispering about, but two decent people caught in a vicious trap. The fear was still in her eyes, but beneath it, a tiny spark of courage was lit. "I will do it," she said, her voice barely audible but firm. "I will tell them what I know. As they rode out of town, a sense of cautious triumph settled over them. They had a witness. It was a fragile hope, but it was more than they had possessed that morning. The air, however, had begun to change. The sky to the west had taken on a hazy, yellowish tinge, and a faint, acrid smell tainted the clean mountain air. Smoke. By the time they reached the high ridge overlooking the valley, they could see it. A plume of dark gray smoke was rising from the dry grasslands in the south, growing larger and darker with every passing moment. The months of little rain and the dry, gusting winds had turned the prairie into a tinderbox. All it took was a single spark, a dry lightning strike from a passing cloud, to unleash a monster, a grass fire. They spurred their horses, racing toward the ranch. The smell of smoke was stronger now, and they could see a line of orange flame licking at the horizon, moving with frightening speed. This was a threat that made Silas Dugan seem small, an enemy that could not be reasoned with or fought in a courtroom. By the time they reached Stone Creek, the sky was a bruised twilight, though it was only mid-afternoon. Ash, like black snow, drifted down, coating everything in a fine, gray powder. Other ranchers were already out, their figures small and determined against the ominous backdrop of the approaching fire. Men who had been whispering behind their backs now rode up to Caleb, their faces grim. In the face of a common enemy, town gossip meant nothing. Survival was all that mattered. A firebreak was their only hope. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy. Men and women side by side. Caleb, with his knowledge of the land, directed the effort, his voice a calm, authoritative force in the growing chaos. They plowed and dug, clearing a wide swath of land down to the bare earth, a desperate scar intended to starve the fire of its fuel. Lily worked alongside them, her face smudged with soot, her arms aching. She carried buckets of water, helped a neighbor's wife gather terrified children, and tore strips from her own petticoat to make bandages for a man who had burned his hands. She was no longer the outsider, the housekeeper. She was one of them, a part of the human wall standing against the inferno. The fire came on like a freight train, a roaring wall of flame 50 feet high, devouring the dry grass with a terrible, insatiable hunger. The heat was a physical blow, and the smoke was a choking, blinding fog. For hours, they fought, beating at the embers that jumped the firebreak with wet sacks and blankets, their faces lit by the hellish orange glow. It was in the midst of this chaos that Caleb saw them. Through a gap in the thick, swirling smoke, he spotted 2 riders. It was Dugan's men, the same 2 who had threatened him before. They were not fighting the fire. They were on the far side of his pasture, deliberately driving his small herd of cattle away from the safety of the corrals and toward a narrow ravine where the fire was threatening to jump the creek. Their plan was as vicious as it was clear. If his herd was lost in the fire, it could be argued that he had started the blaze himself to collect on losses or to clear land. It was a move of pure, destructive malice. A cold rage, clean and sharp, cut through Caleb's exhaustion. He vaulted onto Dust Devil's back and raced toward them, Lily seeing the look on his face and screaming his name in warning. He cut them off before they could drive the panicked animals into the ravine, his horse skidding to a halt, placing himself between the thugs and his herd.
"Get away from my cattle!"
he yelled, his voice a raw command over the roar of the flames. The larger man just laughed. "Looks like you are having some bad luck." Stone. He reached for the pistol at his hip. But before he could draw, 2 other ranchers who had seen the commotion rode up beside Caleb, their own rifles held ready. They had seen what Dugan's men were doing. They had seen them risking the entire valley for a petty, cruel vendetta. "You heard him," one of the ranchers said, his voice hard. "Get out of here, now!" Outnumbered, the 2 men snarled, turned their horses, and disappeared back into the smoke. The immediate threat was gone, but the poison of their actions hung in the air as the wind shifted and the main fire line moved past them, leaving a blackened, smoldering landscape in its wake. The exhausted community gathered by the creek, their faces stained, their bodies aching. It was then that a figure stumbled out of the haze. It was Mildred Pike, her face streaked with tears and soot, her prim and proper clothing in disarray. She saw Lily and Caleb standing together and staggered toward them, her composure completely gone. "It is my fault," she cried, her voice cracking with guilt and hysteria. "All of it. It was me." Lily stared at her, confused. "What are you talking about, Mrs. Pike?" "The contract?" Mildred sobbed, wringing her hands. "I did it. I saw how that man, Dugan, looked at you. I heard the things he said. I was afraid for you. I thought if I could just get you matched with a good man, an honorable man like Mr. Stone, you would be safe. I thought if I just pushed things along, made it seem official, he would have to do the right thing and marry you. It was a foolish, terrible idea, but I only wanted to help." She took a ragged breath. "I went to Dugan's office to have the contract typed up. I did not know what else to do, but he must have found out. He came to me later. He said he knew what I had done, and that if I did not keep my mouth shut, he would tell everyone I was a forger and a meddler. He took my foolish little plan and twisted it into this monster. He used it to try and steal this land. I was so scared. But tonight, seeing those flames, I could not live with it anymore." The confession spilled out of her, a torrent of good intentions gone horribly wrong. Lily and Caleb stood in stunned silence, the final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. It had not started with greed. It had started with a misguided, desperate act of pity, and Silas Dugan, like a predator, had seized upon it and turned it to his own dark purposes. The fire still burned in the distance, a red glow against the dark mountains. The immediate danger had passed, but the smoldering ruins of the prairie were a testament to the destructive forces that had been unleashed, both by nature and by men. Caleb looked at Lily, at her soot-stained face and the unwavering strength in her eyes. He looked at the repentant, weeping Mrs. Pike. He thought of the frightened Elena Vega. He thought of Dugan's men, driving his cattle toward the flames. He now had the whole, ugly truth. He looked toward the red glow in the sky, a reflection of the cold fire in his own soul. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of an iron vow. "Tomorrow, I am bringing the truth to light." The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cool. The sky washed clean by the storm and scoured by the fire. The air still held a faint, sharp scent of smoke, a reminder of the battle the valley had fought and won together. The courthouse in Red Hollow was a shell, its roof undergoing repairs, so the hearing was to be held in the open air of the town square. It was a fitting stage for a drama that had already been playing out in the whispers and watchful eyes of the entire community. Nearly the whole town had gathered. They stood in a wide, shifting circle around a long trestle table and a few chairs that served as the makeshift court. Circuit Judge Alistair Blackwood, a man whose face was a roadmap of frontier justice, sat at the center, looking weary but impartial. He had seen too much to be easily swayed by theatrics. Caleb and Lily rode in together, sitting tall in their saddles. They did not look like defendants. They looked like two people with a purpose. Lily wore a simple, clean dress, her blue scarf tied neatly at her neck. Her hands, resting on the saddle horn, were steady. Caleb's face was a mask of grim determination. He dismounted and helped her down, his hand lingering for a moment at her waist, a small, public gesture of support that did not go unnoticed. A murmur went through the crowd, a mix of speculation and grudging respect. These were not the broken people the rumors had made them out to be. Silas Dugan was already there, flanked by a slick, well-dressed lawyer from Cheyenne and his two brutish employees. Dugan looked confident, nodding to acquaintances in the crowd, playing the part of the concerned citizen and benefactor. Deputy Sheriff Wade stood near him, his face puffy and his eyes evasive, a sheen of sweat on his upper lip despite the morning chill. Judge Blackwood banged a gavel on the table, and a tense silence fell over the square. The proceedings began with Dugan's lawyer. He was a master of his craft, his voice smooth and reasonable as he laid out his client's version of the story. He spoke of a lonely, honorable rancher and a hopeful young woman. He produced the marriage contract with a flourish, holding it up for all to see, a symbol of a sacred promise. He painted a picture of Lily Hart, abandoned and betrayed, a victim of a cruel man's whims. And he painted Silas Dugan as her noble protector, a man who could not stand by and see an injustice done. His only witness, he announced, was Deputy Sheriff Franklin Wade. Wade shuffled forward, took the oath with his eyes fixed on the ground, and began to lie. His voice was flat, but his story was damning. Yes, he had seen the contract. Yes, that was Caleb Stone's signature. He had been passing by the ranch on patrol, he claimed, and Mr. Stone had called him over to witness it. He remembered the day clearly. It was a fine day. He added a few convincing details, small flourishes of memory that gave the lie the ring of truth. The crowd stirred. The word of the law was a powerful thing, even when the man delivering it was as weak as Wade. Lily felt a cold dread creep into her stomach. It was all so plausible, so neatly constructed. Caleb sat beside her, his face like stone, his gaze locked on Wade, a look of such pure contempt that the deputy visibly flinched. Then it was Caleb's turn. He did not have a lawyer. He stood and faced the judge and the town, alone. "Your Honor," he began, his voice clear and steady. "That document is a forgery. My signature was faked, and my name was used as part of a scheme to drive me off my land. I did not summon Miss Hart here. I pulled her from a flooded creek when her wagon was destroyed. I have given her shelter and a job because she had nowhere else to go, and because it was the decent thing to do." The whispers and lies started after that. This hearing is the culmination of those lies. Dugan's lawyer sneered. "A noble story. Mr. Stone, but do you have any proof, or is this just the desperate tale of a man trying to escape his obligations?" "I have proof," Caleb said. "I have witnesses. I call Miss Elena Vega to the stand." A gasp went through the crowd as Elena, pale but resolute, made her way to the front. She took the oath, her voice trembling but audible. Dugan glared at her, his eyes cold with menace, but she did not look at him. She looked at the judge. "Miss Vega," Caleb said, his voice gentle, "do you recognize this document?" "Yes, sir, I do. She said I typed it." "On whose authority?" She took a deep breath. "A woman came to Mr. Dugan's mercantile. She asked to have it typed. I used the typewriter in the back office, the paper, the ink. It all came from the store." "And did you see Mr. Stone sign this document?" "No, sir, he was not there. The signatures were added later. And there was something else. A few weeks after I typed it, Mr. Dugan called me into his office. He told me that if anyone ever asked about the contract, I was to say I knew nothing. He said my job depended on my silence." The lawyer jumped to his feet, objecting, but the judge waved him down. The first cracks were appearing in Dugan's story. A seed of doubt had been planted in the minds of the townspeople. Caleb had one more witness. I call Mrs. Mildred Pike. Mildred, her face tear-stained but her back straight, walked forward. She did not wait for questions. The moment she was sworn in, the whole story came tumbling out, a flood of guilt and confession. She told the crowd how she had feared for Lily's safety, how she had concocted the foolish plan of the marriage contract out of a misguided desire to protect her. "It was my idea," she cried, her voice breaking. "A foolish, meddling old woman's idea, but I never meant for this. When Silas Dugan found out what I had done, he threatened me. He said he would expose me, ruin me. He forced me to stay quiet while he used my mistake for his own greedy purpose. He is the one who turned this into a weapon. He is the one who terrorized this poor girl and tried to steal an honest man's land." Her words fell into a stunned silence. The entire web of deceit was laid bare. This was not about a broken promise. It was about blackmail, coercion, and a cold-blooded land grab. The mood of the crowd, once suspicious of Caleb, now turned like a tide against Silas Dugan. Angry murmurs rose, and men who had fought the fire alongside Caleb now looked at Dugan with open hostility. Dugan saw the tide turn. His face, once smug, was now a mask of cornered rage. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to his men. The larger of the two thugs took a step forward. "This is a load of nonsense," he bellowed. "Trying to create a distraction? This woman is hysterical." He shoved a man standing next to him, trying to start a brawl. But the people of Red Hollow had had enough. The man who was shoved, a burly blacksmith, shoved back twice as hard. Another rancher stepped in front of Elena Vega, shielding her. Several of the townswomen, their faces hard with righteous anger after fighting the fire, formed a protective line in front of Mildred Pike. The second thug, seeing the brawl was not creating enough chaos, made a desperate move. He drew his pistol. The crowd screamed and fell back. He was not aiming at Caleb. He was aiming at Mildred, the source of the confession. Caleb moved without thinking. He threw himself in front of both Lily and Mildred, his body a shield. A deafening crack echoed through the square. For a heart-stopping moment, Lily thought he had been hit. The bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt, grazing his arm, a thin red line appearing on the fabric. Before the gunman could fire again, he was overwhelmed. The blacksmith tackled him from one side, and two ranchers who had been moving in from the other brought him down in a heap. The first thug was quickly subdued by a group of angry townsmen. In the sudden, shocked silence that followed the gunshot, Lily did the only thing that felt right. She threw her arms around Caleb, clinging to him with a desperate strength. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart against her cheek. All the fear, all the uncertainty, all the carefully constructed walls between them crumbled into dust. In that moment, with a smell of gunpowder in the air and his arms protectively around her, she knew this was home. This was where she belonged. As the dust settled, Deputy Wade made a break for it, trying to slip away in the confusion. But he was stopped by the two ranchers who had helped Caleb with his cattle during the fire. They grabbed him, and in the struggle, a small, heavy pouch fell from his pocket, spilling gold coins onto the dusty ground. Dugan's money, the final proof of his betrayal. Judge Blackwood's face was like thunder. He banged his gavel with a force that seemed to shake the entire square. Silence. He pointed a trembling finger at the now subdued thugs, and then at Wade, who was being held fast. "Arrest these men." Then he turned his gaze on Silas Dugan. "Mr. Dugan," he said, his voice ringing with cold fury. "This hearing is concluded. The contract is null and void. As for you, you are to be taken into custody pending the arrival of the federal marshal. You will be charged with forgery, coercion of a witness, conspiracy to commit fraud, and incitement of violence." As two townsmen, now deputized by the judge's order, led a stunned and defeated Dugan away, a sound began to fill the square. It was the slow, steady tolling of the bell from the old church steeple. It rang out over the crowd, a clear, resonant sound washing over the remnants of chaos. It was the sound of order being restored, the sound of justice, hard-won, finally settling over the valley. The last toll of the church bell faded, leaving behind a profound and ringing silence in the town square. The chaos was over. Silas Dugan, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, was gone, led away toward the town's small jail to await the federal marshal. His two thugs and a disgraced, weeping Franklin Wade were secured alongside him. The townspeople stood in stunned, quiet groups, processing the raw, violent truth that had erupted in their midst. They were no longer a crowd of gossips, but a community that had been tested by fire and lies, and had, in the end, held together. Judge Blackwood, looking a decade older than he had that morning, stood on the makeshift platform. He cleared his throat. And his voice, though weary, carried across the square. "What happened here today," he said, "was a cancer on this town. It grew in the dark, fed by whispers and fear. Law is not just a badge and a gun. It is trust, and that trust was broken." He looked out at the faces of the ranchers, the blacksmith, the shopkeepers. "This town needs to heal, and that healing will begin with choosing a man to wear the badge who is worthy of that trust. An election will be held soon." Amid the quiet murmurs of agreement, Caleb sought out Elena Vega. She stood near the churchyard, her fear replaced by a quiet, trembling dignity. Caleb walked up to her, Lily at his side. Judge Blackwood saw them and came over. "Miss Vega," Caleb said, his voice low and sincere, "you showed a courage today that most men would envy. I made you a promise, and I intend to keep it." Judge Blackwood nodded, his stern gaze softening as he looked at the young woman. "I heard your testimony, Miss, and I heard Caleb Stone's promise. There is a position opening for a county clerk in South Pass City. It requires a sharp mind and an honest character. The job is yours, if you want it, with my personal recommendation." Elena's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She looked at Caleb and Lily, her expression one of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, "both of you." A short time later, Mildred Pike made her way through the parting crowd and stood before them. She did not ask for forgiveness. She simply stood, her hands clasped before her, and spoke to Lily, her voice carrying to those nearby. "I was wrong," she said, her voice clear and stripped of all pretense. "My fear for you made me a fool, and my foolishness made me a coward. I tried to play God with your life, and in doing so, I nearly let the devil win. There is no excuse for what I did, only a deep and lasting regret. I hope, one day, you will find it in your heart not to forgive me, but to understand." Lily looked at the woman who had inadvertently set the entire nightmare in motion. She saw not a villain, but a lonely, frightened person who had acted out of a twisted sense of compassion. She reached out and briefly touched Mildred's arm. "I understand," she said softly. "That is all that matters now." The ride back to Stone Creek was quiet, the world painted in the long, golden hues of late afternoon. The land, though blackened in patches, felt peaceful. The tension that had been a constant companion for weeks was gone, leaving a hollow, peaceful ache in its place. When they arrived at the cabin, it looked different. It was no longer just a shelter or a workplace. It was a sanctuary they had fought for and won. Inside, the setting sun streamed through the window, illuminating the small sprig of cottonwood, now dry, in the glass bottle. Lily turned to Caleb. "Let me see your arm." He took off his shirt, revealing the angry red furrow the bullet had carved along his bicep. It was a shallow wound, but it was a stark, physical reminder of how close he had come to paying a far greater price. She gently washed it with clean water and wrapped it with a strip of linen, her touch careful and light. He sat perfectly still, watching her, his gaze intense. Her nearness was a warmth that seeped past his skin and into his very bones. He had spent years building walls around the memory of his wife, Mary. He had thought his solitude was a way of honoring her, of keeping her memory pure and untouched by a new life. He realized now, as Lily's gentle hands tended to his wound, that his solitude had not been an honor. It had been a prison, a self-imposed punishment for the crime of surviving when she had not. Lily's arrival had not replaced Mary or diminished her memory. She had simply opened the door to the prison and let the light in. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Back there, in the square." She finished tying the bandage and looked up, her face only inches from his. "No," she said, her voice a whisper. "We saved each other." She had a choice now. Her name was cleared. The world was open to her. She had the money Caleb had offered, a way to start fresh anywhere she pleased. The old Lily, the one who had lived in the shadow of fear, would have taken it. She would have run, seeking the safety of anonymity, but she was not that Lily anymore. She had faced down a flood, a blizzard, a fire, and the hatred of a whole town. She had learned to stand her ground. She had learned that a home was not a place you ran to, but a place you built. "I am not leaving. Caleb," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Not unless you ask me to. I am staying, not as your housekeeper, and not because I have nowhere else to go. I am staying because I want to. This place, this is the first place I have ever felt like I belonged." He stood up, his uninjured arm coming up to gently cup her face. His thumb brushed across her cheek, and the touch was a current that connected them, erasing the last of the distance, the last of the doubt. He looked into her eyes and saw his own loneliness reflected there, and he saw it being replaced by a fierce, shining hope. That night, after the chores were done and the animals were settled, he took her hand and led her outside. The sky was a vast, deep velvet, strewn with 1,000,000 diamond-bright stars. The Milky Way was a luminous river flowing across the heavens. They walked to the fence line, the one he had mended, and stood there, looking out at the dark. "Sleeping land, I am not a man of many words. Lily," he began, his voice a low, deep rumble in the quiet of the night. "This ranch, for years, it has just been land, a place to work, a place to remember, a place to be alone. But since you came, it has started to feel like a home again. The silence is not empty anymore." He turned to face her, his hands finding hers, his calloused palms warm and strong around her own. "I know I have nothing fancy to offer, just hard work and a stubborn heart. But it is a heart that is yours, if you will have it." He did not get down on one knee. He did not have a ring. He just stood there, a plain, honest man under a canopy of stars, offering her the only thing he truly owned himself. Lily's own heart felt as if it might burst. "Yes," she breathed, the word a puff of white in the cool night air. "Yes, Caleb, I will have it." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, profound homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and cold, clean air, and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. The wedding was in the autumn, when the aspen trees on the mountainsides had turned a brilliant, shimmering gold. It was a simple affair, held in the meadow by the creek under the wide Wyoming sky. Nearly the entire town of Red Hollow was there, their presence a testament to the healing of a community. Judge Blackwood officiated, and Elena Vega, home for a visit from her new life, stood as Lily's witness. Mildred Pike sat in the front row, her quiet, happy tears a form of blessing. Lily did not wear a traditional white gown, but a simple dress the color of a bluebell, and instead of a veil, she had her blue woolen scarf. After the ceremony, as the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the valley, she walked to the sturdy new fence post at the corner of the pasture, with Caleb at her side. She carefully tied the scarf around it. It was frayed and worn, but the color was still bright, a defiant splash of hope against the weathered wood. It was no longer a symbol of what was lost, but a marker of what had been found. Later that night, as they stood on the porch of their cabin, a single light shone in the window, a warm, golden beacon in the vast, quiet dark. The creek, the same one that had almost taken her life, whispered its eternal song as it flowed past, its waters running clear and steady. The seasons would turn. There would be other storms and other fires, but for the first time in a very long time, the house on Stone Creek was no longer empty. It was full. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. Please comment below where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And be sure to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.